Who is Omar Khadr? Omar Khadr at the time was a 15-year-old boy whose father was Canadian. Omar is Canadian, although he spent a great deal of his early life in Pakistan and Afghanistan, because his father was, at one level, was an NGO of a type. He was an engineer who built bridges. He ran hospitals, he even ran schools. In fact, the thing I like about him was he was the only guy who was able to be allowed to teach young Muslim girls, because the Taliban is completely opposed to that. But he was connected with bin Laden, and bin Laden put the good word out for him. And so he was allowed to run these types of schools. At some point, he took sides. And when the Americans, along with the Northern Alliance, which was a combination of American forces, and Northern Alliance were the former Mujahideen warlords, when they invaded Afghanistan, the father dropped his 15-year-old boy with 6 serious Taliban players, and left his boy there with them in a compound outside Khost in Afghanistan, and said, "I'll be back," but he never came back. And so Omar was in this compound, and he had no choice, but if he wanted to leave, he couldn't leave. And he had no choice in telling his father, "I don't want to go." I remember saying to Omar, "Why didn't you just run away?" And Omar said, "If I ran away to a neighbouring village and someone would take me in, that would be an incredible disrespect to my father, and he may have been killed." If Omar had run away, he'd been killed. And so within 6 weeks of being there, American forces had come to this village looking for a particular individual. They couldn't get him. He wasn't around, but someone said, "Check out this compound. There's some funny stuff going on in there." And so they surround, and it was essentially reservists. There's 50 reservists who surrounded this compound. And there's a guy called Major Watt, who was nowhere near the battlefield. I always liked the fact, I was never a good friend of his. He was far away. And what you normally do in Afghanistan when you've got problems about a particular compound, you send in the Afghani interpreters to go and speak to the people first. He wouldn't allow that. He took the tough approach. And so a firefight broke out. It broke out for several hours. The reservists weren't doing very well. And in fact, the Delta Special Force guy described it as a complete fuck-up. And that's what he said in the court as well. And the reservists were taking injuries because they were behind a wall, and the shrapnel from the wall, the stone shrapnel, was causing all the problems. And so Major Watt had to call for help. So he called for Apache helicopters to strafe the compound. Then he called for air assistance, Hornet F-18s, and 2 of those Hornet F-18s dropped 500-pound, each one 500-pound bomb on the compound and completely demolished it. In fact, military reports suggest that nobody could have survived that bombardment. And then, but they also called for special forces guys, Delta Force, just like these guys here. The Americans don't recognize, or at least don't publicly recognize, that they have a SAS type of force. And so they sent in these special forces guys to mop up what was left. In fact, 2 of them I spent some time with in preparing for trial. If you want to call a trial in Guantanamo a trial. It's not. And so one of them, his non-deployment was OC1. He's the leader, and he goes into the compound by following, and he gives the directions to the different other, I think there were 5 Delta, maybe more, but not much more, 5 Delta Force guys. And they went into the compound, they went into the firefight. and followed by the reservists. And the reservists, they're throwing hand grenades everywhere. And at that point in time, Christopher Spear, a Delta Force officer, unfortunately was killed. He was killed by the explosion of a hand grenade. OC-1 goes down this little alleyway in the compound, for what's left of it. He stays at the corner, moves into the alleyway, heads down. There's a Taliban guy to let him, he kills him. There's my client that he describes as sitting on the ground screaming. He's blinded with because of the bombing. He's got head and body wounds, and his back is to the advancing soldiers. And as a special forces officer, his job is just to clean the place out. So he shot Khadr twice in the back. And that, I tell you, that is a war crime. When you're wounded, you leave the wounded alone. And he was the guy who gave the best evidence in this whole fictional trial that took place. And then he leaves. The prosecution's case is that while Omar Khadr was sitting on the ground, facing this wall, with advancing troops coming at him, that he picked a hand grenade, threw it over the wall. It was 8 feet high, and then it continued for another 80 feet, and somehow or other killed Christopher Spear. That's the fiction. OC-1 gave no evidence that he saw Omar Khadr throw any hand grenade. 2, there was no forensic evidence to show what type of hand grenade. Taliban were using a Japanese type of hand grenade and not an American. There was no forensic evidence to indicate whether it was a friendly fire that killed him or whether it was a Taliban hand grenade. But what the Americans did at trial was they produced a fragment, a shrapnel, from a soldier who had been there that day. And 6 years later, when that shrapnel came out, they used that shrapnel to say, well, if Ben's got it in him, then Omar, that must have been the same shrapnel that killed Christopher Spear. And if that didn't work, the other argument was Omar Khadr was the last man standing, and so it had to be him too. Okay? That was a lie too. Because at the day of the start of the trial, a US sergeant was required to hand out these press clippings to the various international press that were around. And so he started giving out this press clipping. Now what we had was when there is a battle taking place, when it's over, these guys are required, certainly the officers are required to write a report. And Major Watt wrote a report, and his report that I'd had for years said Omar Khadr was the last one alive in the compound. And then when this years later, when these press clippings were being given out by the sergeant to the press were really all excited, and they came looking for me. I got a clue what they're talking about. They weren't press clippings. It was the original copy of the report that took place, written by Major Watt. And that report said there were other Taliban alive at the time, and shooting had taken place. And so we questioned Major Watt under oath, whatever that meant, about why he made that change, and had he lied in making that change. He denied he lied. What he said was, years later, the prosecution came to see him and asked him to reflect on the fact about your memory at that time. And he just realized years later that he had misunderstood what took place. He lied. So that's the evidence against Omar Khadr. And so when Omar Khadr was taken off the battlefield, he was flown to Bagram Hospital. It's an air base. It's also a torture centre. Not unlike Guantanamo. In fact, anyway. And so he was unconscious for a week. And when he woke up from being unconscious, his trouble was only starting. Because he had this torturer chief torturer called Joshua Claus, Sergeant Joshua Claus, whose job was to interrogate him. And there are different types of torture. No one ever calls it torture in Bagram or Guantanamo. They've also got headings. And so Khadr, from the moment he gained consciousness, pain medication was removed, and he would be put in these stress positions on the bed, and he still is blind, and he's blind and paralysed, they would use a small little flashlight into his eyes, creating pain, put him in stress positions that he would scream, and then they would ask him questions. Now Joshua Claus, some of you may even know who he is, not thinking you do, because if you've seen the pictures of Abu Ghraib, where you have this woman soldier standing on a bunch of Muslim bodies with their feet up smoking a cigarette, and pictures of Muslim men in that Abu Ghraib prison in a crucifixion pose, chained to the ceiling, stretched. That was Joshua Claus's team. He did so well in Bagram. He got promoted to Guantanamo, and then from there was given free rein in Iraq. And Claus says that he treated Omar Khadr worse. He didn't actually say worse, wasn't nobody more aggressively than any other detainee. Well, he was the only child, and I think he liked boys. I met Joshua Claus. I met him a couple of years ago in Guantanamo. He was a hero. We were all black. Everybody loved him, and he had the swagger to go with it. But what he did with Omar was based upon the records that we were able to look at, because many are destroyed deliberately, is that he'd interviewed or interrogated Omar 20 to 25 times. And when Omar was able to get off of bed, he was then interrogated in the interrogation rooms. And it's in the interrogation rooms that what he liked to do was he liked to use the crucifixion pose, where Omar, remember, I'm talking about a boy of 15, where Omar would be on his tiptoes, stretched out against the wall, and naked. And these guys are all laughing at him, threatening him. And Joshua talked about how he used fear as a tool. Nothing surprising. And so when Omar would pee himself, then they would laughingly take him down, take his head, and use his head as a mop, and put him back up. Another thing that Claus did was that Omar would be on the night shift. Now, you might remember when you see Omar today, actually, he's in hospital right now. Because, as I said, he's blind, and he's in one eye, and we're trying to save the other eye, and he's partially paralysed here, so we're working on his shoulder right now. So we're trying to save this shoulder that's never been used. But he was on the night shift consistently. And the night shift is you walk up and down this hospital corridor all night with buckets of water. And one of the nurses that we dealt with, and the nursing reports describe how his wounds were seeping as he was doing this walk. And I remember when it hit me. It took a while, a bit slow, But I remember when it hit me that what this hospital was that every bed was a torture chamber. In fact, if you were to speak to the London Guantanamo former detainees, they knew Omar. And they talk about how this old man in Guantanamo befriended Omar, and then Bagram befriended him. And Omar, what he recalls is that Omar was always he'd always had bandages on because of the wounds he was suffering from the torture. And then one day he goes into his room, Claus makes Omar stay outside by the bed, pushes the bed close to the room door so he can hear this old man scream. And then the scream from the old man of pain and the scream from the torturers as they had him, and that man died in that room. And Khadr, Omar, very rarely ever mentions him. And so when I've told you about Claus, I haven't made this up. I've told you have to believe me, I looked at the reports, but you don't have to believe me. There's a documentary that I'm in that says, so you don't want to know the truth. And in that documentary is one of the sidekicks of Claus. And the way these torture teams work is you have an older guy like me, and you've got young kids. Because the American Army's been in, 40 battles, 40 wars in 20 years, they need soldiers. And so it's full of reservists. And these reservists are these young kids, 16, 17, 18. And they're told that what they're doing is the right thing. You may not know that what he says tells you where Bin Laden is. It doesn't matter. Important. We know the importance of that intelligence. And so Damien Cassetti was one of those young soldiers who worked for Claus. And I should tell you, the Claus was given immunity to testify against Omar Khadr because he had killed another Muslim in Bagram. He was charged and convicted, and they gave him immunity. And as I told you, I saw him strutting around Guantanamo like he owned the place. But Damien Cassetti, I have 2 more minutes? Okay, Damien Cassetti is different. And actually, Damien has been reaching out to me over the last, 7, 8 months. He wants to meet Omar. I don't think Omar's ready for Damien. But Damien, forgive me. When Damien talks, Damien can't stand himself. It's like his skin's coming off. He's like, you would think there's all kinds of insects running up and down him. He can't stand himself. And in the documentary, you see him like that. And he says, and he's speaking to the Canadian public, and he says, we did terrible things to that kid. Why does Canada not do anything? And let me show you. And he starts to take his shirt off and he shows you how they all put these tattoos on their body that said, I'm a monster. The senior guy, Claus, makes kids monsters. The system makes these kids monsters. And they're left with the horror of themselves, the guilt of themselves. And like Damien, will they live? Will he kill himself? Who knows? So, whatever, and I remember, I give you a sense of how the soldiers felt about these Muslim prisoners. And no better example to me is, Omar said to me one time, you know, Dennis, before we were flown over to Guantanamo, we weren't fed for days, and we were just given little bits of water. And I was trying to figure out what that was about, and what it was about was these people, these human beings would be put into these orange jumpsuits where you can't move. They're hooded in the plane, and if you many of you probably haven't been in a military cargo plane. Unfortunately, I've been in it too many times. I would never make a parachutist, and I wouldn't be in the military because I can't stand the bumping, and it's just very uncomfortable if you're sitting. If you're lying on the ground in the plane, chained to your feet and your arms like that, you're bouncing all the time. And they were deprived of food and just insufficient water to get you going so that you wouldn't use the toilet on the plane. And you're leaving from Afghanistan all the way over the Atlantic to Cuba. And I'll finish off by saying what took place in Bagram then continued in Cuba, because these were just garbage, human beings. These were just luggage, because when you got them off the plane, they're thrown into a military truck, driven, I don't know, maybe 300-400 yards to an assembly point, and I've been there many times. And when they get out, they're pulled up, and then everybody gets the same treatment. It's like fun. You take a hold of this detainee, and then you grab his head and you smash it against the wall. And people like Omar fell unconscious. And then that's how we introduce you to Guantanamo. And so I went to Guantanamo, pretty naive. I went there as a pretty cocky lawyer. I'd done many landmark cases. I'm a constitutional criminal lawyer, not a human rights lawyer. I remember feeling thought my resume, I didn't think like that, but I'm sure I was thinking along those lines. I got stories to tell. I'm one of the few lawyers ever getting to Guantanamo. And when I arrived in Guantanamo, I didn't go to the cages. When we talk about Guantanamo, we talk about cages. But beyond those cages are 3 secret prisons in the desert. Concrete buildings, air conditioning up top, no windows, barbed wire, and some of the toughest soldiers you'll find. At least according to my Scottish viewpoint of sizing somebody up, you know. And I won't take you into there. All I'm just saying to you, that when I finally got to see Omar, the end product of Omar at that time was this building is desperately silent. It's not bright like here, it's dim. There are no windows in any cells, and they're narrow, probably as narrow as here. And I remember, but I was still an impressive lawyer. I had gone into Guantanamo. Where did I tell the boys back home? And I remember walking into the cell, and I remember gasping, because I saw this young boy sitting on a bed that had no blankets. The place is freezing because we keep the cells ultra cold all the time so that you never rest. You never come to rest. And Omar had spent years in that place without any, and it was only until the last few years did they ever get any books, unlimited books. Until then, you were totally sensory deprived of anything and everything. He never ever saw family, the only lawyer he saw was me. He never had consultation visits, nothing. Canada had abandoned him. And the message that was sent was, do what you want with this kid, we don't care. Meanwhile, every Western country demanded that their adults be returned, and they were. But we left a Canadian kid in hell. And so I remember, here was this boy sitting on the edge of a bed, shackled to the floor and handcuffed. And let me tell you, I've grown up with this kid. And I mean literally. I've sat in a chair over the many years and watched this young boy grow up to be a big man. He's now 27. But when I saw him, and I saw this guy, and this kid was sort of like he was shivering, he was holding on to himself. And that's when they told me that he hadn't spoken for months. He'd just withdrawn. And when I look at that picture of him, what did I see? It reminded me of a broken little bird, a little sparrow. And I never thought in my lifetime, the guy we thought he'd seen it all, full of pomposity, would ever be in a place like that. And eventually, for 2 days, he never talked. And I thought on the third day that I was going home and I couldn't represent him anymore because you haven't given me your instructions. And so finally, I got absolutely bored, and I'm just at the end, so I took up your time. I pulled out my wallet and my credit card, but I had some cards in there of my youngest boy, Duncan, who plays hockey. I don't know if you have them here, but you have these hockey cards where you got your young kid wearing his uniform and his number on the front, and on the back is all the little details and the name of the team, you know, the Atoms or the Killers or whatever it is the boys like. And I gave it to Omar. And it was only then that he took it and he started to feel it, because he hadn't felt paper in years. And then he started talking to me. And I remember what he said to me. He said, "You will leave me." Everybody does. And so I made a promise to him that day that I wouldn't. And I could tell you, I don't want to make you think that I'm some kind of hero. I've wanted to leave Omar 1,000,000 times. I've spent my family savings to keep litigating on his behalf. I'm absolutely pro bono. I've had 1,000 people tell me what a great guy I am, and not a penny. I have judges and lawyers when I've done it with me and tell me, keep up the good work. And I get to a point where I want to scream and attack, you know. And in all those years that I've been in Guantanamo, I never saw Omar walk. He was always chained. And so my last comment is, I've had many experiences in Guantanamo. I've had experiences being on a plane where the Americans have taken me to a secret airport and questioned me all day. Why am I representing this guy? Let me go through your computer. But one of the resonating things that's always stuck with me when I want to walk away was the imagery of Omar. And one time I went to see Omar, and you can actually interview your client in a sort of a steel cage outside. Remember, when you interview your client, you're never alone. There's no solicitor-client privilege. Cameras, taped, soldiers. But I remember one time going by this cage where this man was in there. I couldn't see him. And I heard him pray. I'm assuming he prayed. And in my 60s, I don't think I'd ever heard such a plaintive cry, such a haunting, desperate cry. And I don't know what he said, but I have always assumed that what he was saying, he was praying to his God. Essentially saying, how could you leave me in a place like this? And so Guantanamo changed me forever. And so, when I left Guantanamo, I thought, I'm going to fight this. Big talk. What experience did I have to take on governments? None to take on big governments. And I'm saying this for your purpose, about taking things on. But I did eventually. I did take them on. And I've taken them on successfully. And I've continued to take them on. And I don't intend to rest. Thank you.
It was actually on the 17th of March that I joined the Army 17 years ago. And it was a Monday. I'm sure it was a Monday. You could probably check the calendar for that. Anyway, when I joined the British Army, my ideas were based on a false history. I'd been taught, or I'd read about our involvement in Malaya in the 1950s, and we've got a veteran here tonight from that campaign. And all I read about was this amazing Hearts and Minds campaign, and how we'd won the local people over to our democratic ways. And similar stories about campaigns in Oman, Aden, Northern Ireland. So when I joined, I had these false ideas based on the propaganda that the state puts out, based on the propaganda that the military puts out. In 2002, I think that was when Omar Khadr was picked up, I was in Kabul, and I wasn't in Special Forces at the time. I was in the parachute regiment, and we weren't involved in any of this, taking prisoners or anything like that. But you could see the helicopters flying out with the Special Forces soldiers on, and you could see them at Bagram airport, and you see them floating around. You could see there was something going on, and it was all very secretive and all sort of kept very much apart from us. But in 2005, I deployed to Baghdad, and was involved in exactly the same system that had been put in place in Afghanistan, and this system is still in place now. It's become more sophisticated over time, and so what I'm going to do tonight is try and briefly describe how it is. Like we just heard from Glenn there, and Glenn's approach when he met someone in a vulnerable situation, he had a human response. But how is it that soldiers can sink to the depravity that Dennis has described tonight? And my own ideas on it is that it's through a process of what I would call compartmentalisation, and that is that when you want to carry out something that's abhorrent, you need to break it down into little easily digestible parts. I'm going to describe how that process was carried out in Baghdad, and it was a very similar process that was carried out in Afghanistan as well. So what you do is you break down this bigger task of capturing people and then torturing them into very small little parts. And the start of that chain is the intelligence, where the intelligence comes from. Now, a lot of the intelligence that, especially when I was serving, and I think it still goes on now, was what they call human intelligence. And that means someone from the local indigenous population telling stories about someone else. And I think in Afghanistan and Pakistan, a lot of the guys who ended up in Guantanamo were actually sold out by other people. There were bounties offered. And that's what it's about money. And if you offer someone money for intelligence in a country where there's high unemployment and there's not much money around and people are starving, guess what? They'll keep coming back and they'll give you more intelligence. So this whole system is based in part on intelligence that people have paid for. And even if someone comes to you and says, this guy down the road, he's involved with Al-Qaeda or he's involved with the insurgency, and he might be. But the next time he comes to you and he wants that $200, he's going to grass up someone else, And he might just grass up someone he's had a feud with over the years, or he might grass up someone who's of a different ethnic background, or someone who's of a different religious, from a different religious sect. And then this information is passed on to surveillance teams. And the problem is that when a surveillance team has been told that this person is a terrorist or this person is an insurgent, everything those people do then becomes, they see guilt or suspicion in everything those people do. So say you've been tasked to watch a certain house and you're asked to watch a certain person. If you see that person go around the back of the house and start digging, you don't think that guy's digging some potatoes or digging in some vegetables. You think, what's he hiding around the back? If you see him put some bags in the car and go to another building, you don't think, he's just taking some stuff round to his mate's house. You think, this guy is going to is obviously part of this bigger network. So everything these people do becomes suspicious. But the problem with the guys who carry out the surveillances is that they see these people in a family situation. They see them taking their kids to school. They see them going to work. They see them smoking on the front door. They see them having fun with their family. So you don't want the guys doing the surveillance to then carry out the detention operation. You want a different set of guys to do that. Guys who haven't seen these people in their sort of normal human environment. So then the job gets handed on to the detention team, and that's what I was involved in. I was involved in it's called all sorts of things in the press. A lot of times it's called stuff in the press that I never heard those terms used when I was in, but the term they use in the press is a kill or capture team. And our job was to go out in the middle of the night usually, smash our way into people's houses with explosives and detain these people. I'm just going to describe a generic one of those raids just because I want you to try and understand what it must be like to be on the receiving end of that and how terrifying that must be. So we'd usually sneak up to a building in the middle of the night, and I just want you to imagine now that it's 1 o'clock in the morning, it's dark, it's quiet, you're in bed in your house, your children are sleeping next door, you're in bed with your husband or your wife or whatever, and it's all very still. and all of a sudden there's a huge explosion that rips your house apart almost. That's us coming through the wall or coming through the door. And what your ears must be ringing, and there's dust everywhere, and it's still dark, and you can hear men, heavy men, rampaging through the house. And before you know what's happened, they're in your room, and they're dragging you out of your bed. And we used to go into these buildings, we used to dominate every room. And once we'd secured the place, we'd separate people out, women and children into one room, the men into another room. And then one of our guys who was an Arabist, he'd start interrogating these people. And we were always taught that the most important intelligence you can gain is at the point of capture, the shock of capture they call it, when someone's so terrified they'll say anything. And you know what, the police use this as well in domestic. So one of our guys would be interrogating this man, and then my job along with another few guys was to go and ransack the house. And we'd go around the house and we'd just tip it all apart. We'd just drag everything out. You know, the women would be really upset, the kids would be upset, we'd just be dragging everything out. We'd get all the computers, money, phones, any weapons in the house, any pieces of paper that looked sort of important, and then we'd chuck them into these big sacks. And this used to take maybe 10 or 20 minutes, and then we'd drag all this out into the main hallway. The interrogation would be finished by then, and then we'd take all of this stuff out of the house along with the mails. Now, a lot of the time we'd be given a name or shown a picture of someone that we were after, and when we got in there, he wasn't there. But that didn't matter. We'd just take whoever else was in there, because they must know something about what was going on, because they're in the same building. So quite a lot of the time we took people in who we weren't even looking for. And the sort of guidelines we had was anyone of military age, any male of military age. So, you know, that was sort of like 15, 16, up to 65. We took, you know, really elderly people, really young people. And then we'd drag these people out of the houses, and a lot of the time it was the first time these people had been in a helicopter. You know, I can't imagine how terrified they were. And then we'd take them back to our camp. And I often used to think after coming in off these jobs, you know, what have we just done? You know, we've destroyed the security of the home. We've traumatized everyone in the house. We've taken everything of any value. We've humiliated the males in front of their family. And then we've taken away the breadwinner, the guy who's going to look after this family, and then taken them out of there. And this started to really get to me, you know, and I used to, when I was on these jobs, I used to look at these children and think, what must they be thinking about us, you know? Anyway, after our part was finished, once we got these people back to our base, we would just stand them up against the wall, exactly the same as what Dennis was saying in this position. And by the time we took these people back to the base, they'd be in their dish dash, which is like the traditional sort of clothing that people often wear to bed in Arab countries. And they'd either have a goggles on, or they'd have a hood on and some earphones over their ears. And we'd use these plastic ties to hold their hands together. Now, by the time we'd taken these people back to our base, what do those people look like? What have we turned them into? They look like terrorists, because that's what you're told a terrorist looks like. And so the people we handed them over to, who started the interrogations, to them, they're not seeing the person who took their kids to school or the person going around their daily lives. They're seeing a man terrified with his hands cuffed and the hood on or the goggles on. He sees a terrorist. We used to hand these people over. We never got to see these people again, and they ended up. I found out afterwards, actually, they ended up in a secret prison network. Just like Guantanamo, the ideas of Bagram, Guantanamo spread. And there was a secret prison network in Iraq, and these people would be interrogated, and then their value would be assessed. And depending on how significant they thought these people were, some would end up in Abu Ghraib. That was actually the better prison to go in. Then they had more secretive prisons. There was one called Camp Nammo at Baghdad International Airport. And the RAF were actually in charge of guarding this, you know. And one of the guys who worked there has actually described how these men were held in these like dog kennels in the sun, out in the sun, and then they'd just be taken out and tortured and interrogated further. And so by the time these people are in this system, then they become completely dehumanised. And I often liken it to what the Germans must have done. Like, people often wonder, don't they, how how did Germany, how did they carry out this genocide? Well, it was through the same system. So a French policeman goes into a French Jew's house and pulls them out into the night. Then he hands them over to the train driver. All he does is drive the train. They might even swap train drivers on the way, and then another train driver takes them into Belsen or Auschwitz. And then someone else takes them off the train and strips them and shaves their head and gives them a stripy outfit. And then someone else takes them and, you know, forces them to work these crazy hours, you know. And then someone else eventually puts them in the chamber. And it's the same process. You split this thing up and you give people more easily digestible jobs. And I actually believe that if one person was to follow the whole chain of events, you'd never be able to do it. You'd never be able to go from seeing that person in their family life to the outcome. You know, whether it's Guantanamo, Bagram or Auschwitz, it's all the same. So that's the process that's going on. So I think I'll leave it there and hand back to Glenn, and maybe we could go, I don't know how much time we've got, maybe we